For years, Russia has sold the world an illusion, an economic superpower, immune to sanctions, untouchable by Western pressure. But behind the propaganda, that illusion is crumbling. Inflation is rising, the ruble is collapsing, and Western sanctions are cutting deeper than the Kremlin admits. War spending is draining the country's resources, and everyday Russians are paying the price. Food and energy costs are soaring, wages are stagnant, and businesses are shutting down. Even Russia's wealthiest elites are starting to feel the pressure. The government is scrambling to keep the illusion alive, but the cracks are widening. The collapse isn't coming in the distant future. It's already underway. This is the dark truth of Russia. In the early 2000s, Russia emerged from the chaos of the Soviet collapse and built its economy on one powerful resource: oil and gas. As energy prices soared, Russia's revenues exploded, fueling a decade of rapid growth. The economy more than quadrupled in size, wages rose, and Moscow positioned itself as a global energy superpower. With billions pouring in, the government stabilized the economy, rebuilt infrastructure, and expanded military spending. High oil prices created an illusion of strength. Russia looked like it was on an unstoppable rise. But beneath the surface, there was a massive problem. The country had become dangerously dependent on energy exports. Oil and gas made up nearly half of the government's budget, meaning that Russia's success relied entirely on global demand staying high. While other nations invested in technology and industry, Russia remained locked into a single sector. For years, this energy-fueled boom kept the country afloat. But a system built on a single resource is fragile, and Russia's economy was far more vulnerable than it seemed. When oil prices fell and geopolitical tensions rose, the cracks in Russia's economic model became impossible to ignore. Then, in 2022, everything changed. The invasion of Ukraine triggered an economic war unlike anything Russia had faced before, one that would push its fragile economy to the breaking point. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, it didn't just start a war on the battlefield, it also triggered an economic war that would push the country to its limits. Almost overnight, Western nations unleashed the harshest sanctions in modern history, cutting Russia off from the global financial system. More than $300 billion in Russian assets were frozen, major banks were banned from international markets, and thousands of Western companies, including McDonald's, Apple, and IKEA, shut down operations, leaving entire industries in chaos. At first, the Kremlin insisted that Russia could survive. The government propped up the ruble, nationalized abandoned businesses, and redirected trade toward China and India. On the surface, it seemed like Russia was holding steady, but beneath the propaganda, cracks were forming. The ruble's value was artificially maintained by strict capital controls, masking its true weakness. The loss of Western technology crippled key industries. Car manufacturing collapsed, aviation struggled, and the energy sector faced a supply chain crisis. Meanwhile, inflation soared, and the cost of basic goods skyrocketed. As economic pressure mounted, the Kremlin made a fateful decision. It turned Russia into a war economy. Billions were funneled into military spending, while social programs and infrastructure took a backseat. The government demanded more weapons, more tanks, more soldiers, all while the civilian economy weakened. For a time, Russia's tactics kept the system from completely falling apart. But an economy built for war comes with a cost. And soon the consequences would become impossible to ignore. As Russia funneled resources into its war efforts, the domestic economy began to overheat. By late 2024, inflation had surged close to double digits, driving up the cost of everyday goods. Food, fuel, and housing became increasingly unaffordable, forcing millions of Russians to cut back on basic necessities. To fight inflation, the Central Bank of Russia took drastic action, raising interest rates to levels not seen in decades. But while this temporarily stabilized the ruble, it came at a cost. Businesses struggled to secure loans, real estate collapsed, and small enterprises shut down at alarming rates. The economy wasn't just slowing down, it was suffocating. At the same time, the country faced a severe labor shortage. Unemployment dropped to record lows, but not because the economy was thriving. Millions had been pulled into the war effort. Between conscription, forced recruitment, and mass emigration, entire industries were left without workers. Construction, agriculture, and manufacturing ground to a halt, while defense contractors absorbed what little workforce remained. With rising prices, disappearing jobs, and an unstable currency, ordinary Russians bore the brunt of the crisis. Every ruble was worth less, every paycheck stretched thinner, and every passing month felt more uncertain than the last. The government claimed the economy was under control, but for those living through it, the cracks were impossible to ignore. And as economic pressure mounted, the government had two choices: adapt or tighten its grip. It chose the latter. And with that decision, Russia's economic crisis turned into something even more dangerous. As inflation soared and labor shortages worsened, the Russian government had a choice: adapt or double down. It chose the latter. Instead of easing economic pressure, the Kremlin tightened its grip. Interest rates remained high, war spending increased, and industries were forced to comply with strict state controls. The same top-down economic planning that crippled the Soviet Union was being repeated. For decades, Russia's economy had been built on raw materials and state influence rather than private sector innovation. But in a modern world where technology and entrepreneurship drive growth, this model was outdated. Foreign companies had left, private investment had collapsed, and the government's only solution was more control. In an attempt to keep the economy moving, the state forced companies to meet wartime production quotas, even if they weren't profitable. Factories that once produced consumer goods were repurposed for military use, stripping supply chains of critical materials. Meanwhile, the middle class, Russia's economic backbone, was shrinking as salaries stagnated and purchasing power declined. Wages were suppressed, businesses were nationalized, and the state took an even greater role in economic management. But history had already shown where this path leads: to stagnation, inefficiency, and long-term decline. Still, Putin's government refused to acknowledge the cracks. Instead, it tightened censorship, crushed dissent, and insisted that the economy was stable. The message was clear: Russia wasn't just fighting a war on the battlefield, it was fighting a war against reality. But there was one thing the Kremlin couldn't control: the growing unrest among its own people. For years, the Russian government controlled the narrative. Propaganda painted a picture of stability, and for a while, many Russians believed it. But as economic pressures intensified, cracks in that illusion began to show. Prices kept rising, wages stagnated, and everyday life became harder. Factories couldn't meet demand, stores faced shortages, and people struggled to afford even basic necessities. The Kremlin had spent years blaming the West, NATO, and Ukraine for Russia's struggles, but now Russians were starting to question their own leaders. Protests, once rare and dangerous, started to re-emerge. Workers in unpaid industries walked off the job. Anti-war sentiment, once silenced, was growing. And with military losses mounting, the government faced a new challenge: keeping its own people in line. Desperation was setting in. Rural regions, once strongholds of loyalty, were feeling the full weight of economic decline. Young men were either at war, fleeing the country, or unable to find work. In major cities, underground networks of opposition were forming. People who had once stayed silent were now finding ways to resist. The response was predictable: harsher crackdowns, more censorship, mass arrests. But repression can only go so far. History has shown that no economy can survive forever on fear alone. So the real question isn't just whether Russia's economy is collapsing, it's how long the people will endure it before something snaps. The Kremlin has spent years insisting that Russia's economy is stable, that sanctions don't work, and that the country can outlast the West. But beneath the surface, the cracks are widening. Russia is now trapped in a war economy, one where military production takes priority over everything else. Roads, hospitals, and schools are being neglected. The ruble is weakening, foreign reserves are dwindling, and the cost of war is draining what little financial stability remains. The country is running out of skilled workers, investment has dried up, and industries that once thrived are now struggling to survive. In the short term, Russia can keep going. The government still has ways to manipulate the economy, control wages, and suppress unrest. But in the long run, the question isn't if Russia's economy will collapse. It's when. Every empire has its breaking point. The Soviet Union lasted decades before it finally fell apart. How much longer can Putin's Russia hold on? And when the collapse comes, what happens next? One thing is certain: Russia, as we know it, will never be the same.